Chapter 5, Ethnocentrism and Racism. Here are the learning objectives for Chapter 5. We are going to define some of these terms that the book, that Chapter 5 went over. So we have an ethnic group, and it is a group of people who share cultural characteristics. There's religion, language, the way they eat, where they are from, and they have a common history. Ethnocentrism is when someone looks at the world through the lens of where they're from or who they are. So they believe that their own group is superior and everyone else is more inferior in a way, and they compare those people to themselves and what they've known as growing up. So that can lead to people being prejudiced, especially people that they don't know or haven't understood. Sometimes when it comes to superiority, there is superiority when it comes to politics, morals, God's will, what's better for the nation, and historical situations. So it could be looked at as executions of different groups of people, and that could be people as far as race, ethnic background, or even disabilities in some sense. Race is where you can see somebody's physical characteristics. So they might have similar characteristics to other people that sort of look like them. Race is a social construct. So it's just things that we can see, not things that are internal like biology. And then there's racism, and that's the belief that there is one group that is better than another group. And the group that they believe is less than them are people that end up being dehumanized, end up being told that they're lazy or not as smart or not deserving of certain parts of the country or certain parts of benefits that a system may have. So they believe other people are inferior, and they like to have control over those people that they believe are inferior because they believe having control over them will keep them in line and make things better for everyone else. Moving on from that, there's prejudice, and that is when people have ideas or thoughts in their head about a certain group or a thing even, and those thoughts are negative. And they believe that. And a lot of it comes from fear, applying stereotypes to an entire group from maybe one negative situation. Instead of saying that this person is, bad or this person is a robber, they'll say the whole group of people are bad or robbers. It could be anything that the person deems is different from who they are. So they're judging from their own lens, from their own eyes, their own experience, their own beliefs, and saying that this person that's different is less than. Discrimination is basically when someone is treated less than in a certain situation. So it could be like less access to healthcare, having less patience with them if they're a kid in a classroom just because of what they look like. So discrimination can happen in different ways. It could happen from race, religious affiliation, income. It could happen from nationality, ability or disability, beliefs. It can be physical, also with negative attitudes. So if you want to get more into a deep dive of discrimination, that is going to be on page 237, and it goes into 238. But there's 4 different types of discrimination that it talks about in the book if you want more information or more of an explanation of what the text, the author, places value on in this book when it comes to discrimination. And then there's legal forms of discrimination that the book talks about. De jure discrimination, and that just means it's something that's legal. So maybe not serving a certain group of people, or maybe having laws that say it's legal to take things from other people, maybe take their land, maybe take their housing. And then there's de facto discrimination, and that's discrimination that people do to one another or groups do to one another. Situations happen that supports the discrimination. That's more of the everyday type of discrimination that a person might witness versus the law. So there are stereotypes of different groups of people. The media pushes stereotypes more in order to get people to believe certain things about other people they might not have met or they might end up fearing. But basically, it pits people against one another and has people believe negative things about a group of people or of a person that they don't know. In the textbook, it talks about discrimination being the problem of people that are labeled white. So it talks about back in the day, decades ago, in the early 1900s and some in the 1800s, how people were treated differently and they weren't put into the group labeled white. So white would be looked at less than as race, but more so as a status or a social status that a person might have. Just either by the way they look or the way they think or maybe like the job that they have. It's nothing that a person is doing. It's just like where the system places a person, whether they want to be there or not, whether they want to be part of it or not. So the book talks about in the 1800s and 1900s how Irish, Italians, and Polish people were discriminated against and treated less than, had to live in slums, were told that they were lazy, that they were causing crimes. So when they had the ability to be absorbed into the group that's labeled white in the U.S., they took that because it would make things better for their children. It would give them more opportunities. And they were tired of dealing with the discrimination and prejudiceness and, all of the discrimination that they faced at the time. So they did it as more of a means of survival. Not out of hate for other groups. It was just that they wanted a better life for their family and, of course, their offspring, which most people are going to want. It talks about discrimination against Arab Americans or Muslims in the U.S. It talks about how people have conflated or believed in the idea that after 9/11 that anyone with hijab or niqab or people that are covering themselves, they believe that, or even people that they saw wearing turbans, they believe that they maybe supported these things. They were supported the trouble that America was having when it came to 9/11 and all the people that lost their lives during that time. So any situation that people were scared about or they heard there might be danger when it came to airplanes, or even like the safety of their kids in schools, they started, groups of people, many people started blaming anybody who they thought looked like the people that had hijacked those planes in the media. So there were some issues after 9/11 that continued, and it ended up affecting more than just the people that were part of 9/11. It affected people that others might assume look like them, and that was Muslim Americans and Arab Americans. And then there were hate crimes that happened, but basically almost all states have laws or rules against hate crimes and hurting someone because of what they look like or their race, their religion, their ability or disability. And so the book goes into more information. It does a spotlight on diversity, 5.2, and that is on page 240 and 241. And it talks about how Arab Americans and Muslims in America had to deal with those issues at the time and how some of that continued on from those situations. It also talks about how different groups in the U.S. have faced persecution or discrimination in different ways. And if you want more information on that, that's also around 241 to 242. It talks about how race is a social concept. So it's a social construct. Basically, race was made up. Humans are more alike than they are different, biologically speaking. So the things that might make people different is maybe their thoughts, their religion, their language, where they are from. But the thing, at least in the US, the thing that makes people different is just by looking at them and seeing if their hair texture is different, hair color is different, eye color, skin color is different than someone else's. So all those things can be looked at. And people can say, oh, if someone has blue eyes, they are like this type of person. Or if someone has red hair, they're this type of person. And then they'll say, like, the whole group behaves this way, or doesn't do these things, or does do these things. But basically, race in the U.S. Is more of a status or a ranking. If you look at a system and it has like a rungs of a ladder, it's basically where people are placed, whether they want to be there or not. So it's part of the system. Of course, there are people that do things that are racist or rude or mean or discriminatory, but things that affect people that are more important, such as jobs, housing, medical care, those are the things that, really make a difference and are more important. And those are things that are part of a macro system, in an organizational way, and then also in a community way. So some of these issues can be looked at as when it comes to access to hospitals. If people have hospitals in their area, do they have transportation to get to those hospitals? When they get to those hospitals, are they treated in an equal way? Are they treated for as being a person and having a health issue, or do the doctors or the medical staff treat them differently and negatively because of maybe prior biases, maybe current thoughts, or maybe some outdated literature that they might believe, such as one thing that is a myth is that black people can take more pain, or that black people have thicker skin than other people. So some people have been taught that and believe it, and they'll treat their patients as such, and other people have been taught that, and they don't believe it, or people were never taught that, and they were just taught people were people. And they treat people accordingly. When it comes to prejudice and discrimination, there has been plenty of research done on it. And so in this textbook, they've come to a consensus of what they believe are reasons that people practice discrimination and are prejudiced toward other people. Sometimes it's blamed on fear, sometimes it's blamed on lack of understanding. People pass down these ideas and teach them to their children. Children don't hate one another. It has to be brought to them to learn those things. But the textbook talks about projection, so that's when somebody feels a certain way about themselves, maybe insecure, and then they place it on another person or a group of people, so they're projecting their flaws that they believe they have onto other people, and it's what they don't see in themselves. So sometimes a person might say, oh, this person was violent, or they are violent, talking about the whole group, but in reality, it just means that that person comes from violence or believes in it, and they don't see it in themselves, but they see it in other people. There is frustration, aggression, and that's when somebody might be really stressed out, or the world might be tense, and then they find someone to blame. So they might say that someone took this opportunity from them, or someone else didn't deserve a certain opportunity. And that's when a person is like a scapegoat. They're just basically finding someone to blame for their issue instead of taking accountability and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, which is, a common American phrase, and doing what they have to do to make their lives easier and to make their families' lives easier. But some people will sit in the feelings of hatred and blame others. Then there are people that feel insecure and they feel inferior. They see someone doing better, or maybe a person that has dealt with a situation better than they have, and so they end up not liking that person. Instead of seeing them as a source of strength or someone that they could learn from and they could work together, they see that person as a competitor, a person that is taking resources from them. And so they take their anger out on the person, instead of what could be happening to all the people within the system, since everyone is placed in a system whether they want to or not. There is authoritarianism, and that's when someone has a personality that's more authoritarian, and they would like to have control over people and situations. They believe in fascism, and they don't like things that they don't understand or they don't know. It makes them uncomfortable. So they want people to react a certain way and be a certain way so things are more calm for them. And anyone who falls out of that, who is more radical or different, they don't like, and they make negative assumptions and prejudgments about them. When it comes to history, there are historical explanations of treating people second class, and sometimes people continue those thoughts later on, as in today, versus just leaving those situations in the past. As exploitation, some people believe that it's okay to use people to have cheap labor, or to use people when it's time to work, or to use people to do the type of work that they wouldn't do themselves. And so they believe these people are second class people, so they might speak to them in a negative way, talk down to them, talk about people who look like them or the children of those people, but they actually believe that those people are inferior and this is where they should live, this is how they should live, they should have less access to resources, less money. It's the type of people that get upset if they see somebody who has money or who is happy being who they are, and since they weren't taught to see the world that way or to see that person as achieving that status, they either think the person is stealing or and do something illegal. And they might question if the person lives in that neighborhood, or if the person is sitting in a parking lot, maybe they think that the person is there to rob somebody instead of just sitting in their car waiting on somebody. So there's different ways that this can play out in life. The book gets into more of a description of it if you are interested in these things, or want to seek more of an understanding of what the text is trying to convey. It also talks about patterns, telling people how they should dress, how they should act, how they should wear their hair. And that could be passed from generation to generation. And that might be something that becomes normalized over time, um, such as laws telling people they have to cover their hair, or telling people that their hair has to be straight in order to be accepted. And then there's also, when it comes to religion, there's different religions, and then there's people that believe that only their religion is true, and the other religions, they don't believe that they are valid in any way. So they might have an attitude toward that person, or a prejudice toward or against that person. They might believe that they are part of the group of a chosen few that God is there for, and the other people aren't part of it. And so that's why their situation in life is less. The book also mentions um, the beliefs that people have and their promotion that they are better than people of other backgrounds. The book calls it white supremacy and sees it and views it as more as a political ideology of where to place people, as far as social status goes, income, job status, what's normalized and what's not normalized. Um, and then there were, some laws to support those things when it came to housing, or Jim Crow laws, or sundown towns, basically saying where people can and can't go, where people could travel, making sure they had their travel papers that were signed off on and stating that where they're going, and where they're coming to, and anybody feel like they had the right to check those things. And you can still maybe see some of that play out today in certain situations. Usually these videos that go viral online, where a person might feel like they have a right to question someone else that they don't know, just based off of looks. And those ideas come from ideas in the way the country was before, in the past. But once again, there's spotlight on diversity in this textbook on page 247 is one. It talks about racial discrimination. And as I mentioned before, on page 240, it talks about Muslims and Arab Americans. When discrimination happens and is rampant, there are some things that can happen to the people that end up having to deal with the situation. So one of those things would be making it difficult for people to get things that would make their lives easier, such as housing, resources, finances, a good education, access to good jobs, access to quality health care. They might not experience the same justice system as other people. They might not get charged the same way when it comes to crimes as other people. They might not have the opportunity to explain themselves in situations as other people might have. And some of that you can see played out when it deals with redlining or, the effects of the mass shootings, the aftermath of it. When it comes to scholarships, you might see that, or the people that know people and are able to get certain jobs, because you've all heard it's not what you know, it's who you know. So there are people that it is more difficult for them to attain these things. It doesn't mean that they can't. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just might mean that they might have more things to deal with, but they are still able to accomplish it if they just stick to it. So discrimination does have a high cost for everyone, especially when it comes to healthcare, because that means that the people that are discriminated against will usually just get sicker and then end up using the ER as a way of dealing with their health issues, and they usually can't pay by then. And then, because the person is getting really sick, they have to work less, they might have lost their health insurance. But basically, those costs are going to go back to everyone else, either through taxes or through anybody who uses that hospital or those systems of hospitals, even if it's not in that same area. So it does actually cost more overall. If people were just given the same quality care and worked on preventative care before people ever got really sick, then that would just be better for everyone. If we're talking about the amount of money and the social burden it has over time. And also it talks about that people who could actually benefit if people were to work together, sometimes they vote against their best interests, or because they know that people aren't talking and discussing things with one another of what would make all of their lives easier, especially people that are in a certain class. If everybody who was working class worked together, then things would change as far as wages, benefits, vacations, healthcare. All those things would change if they came to work together. So like with disability, a lot of people from various backgrounds went and worked together in DC. And they had these protests. This was like all in the 90s. And all the people, they were able to get the American with Disabilities Act passed, but they had to come together. And that was, before social media and all of that. But they wanted help dealing with their disabilities, and they wanted to be able to work. They wanted to be able to have access to health insurance. So they had to come together no matter what they look like, no matter what they believe, where they're from. They all had the common goal of making sure that people with different disabilities were able to have some benefits, as people that live in America, hoping that they can one day attain some type of American dream despite being disabled. So there's stereotyping and multiculturalism. So the book talks about that. It talks about how the Social Workers Code of Ethics just basically says that no one should be discriminated against. Make sure you help everybody despite all these things that people might use to not help one another. And then it also wants people to understand the groups that they're working with, whether it's the type of pay that they have, or it's their culture, or if it's their language. Basically meeting people where they are and then trying to help them. So just basically taking out the stereotyping, and then having more of an acceptance for multiculturalism as far as social work goes, because that means that they're able to help more people over time. The demographics of the country are changing, and they have been changing, and it's important to want to help people, especially if you're going to go into social work or healthcare. It's about helping others and doing no harm. Moving on to intersectionality, it just means that people have maybe more than one thing counting against them when it comes to systems of oppression. So the textbook talks about, a person might have a certain race, ethnicity, religion, gender, class, age, disability, social status, cultural categories, and basically saying that person might be, houseless and from in age, like maybe they're a teenager, so they're houseless and they're a teenager, so they have less access to jobs just based off the fact that they're a teenager, especially if you think of the younger ones. And then having a home is a type of disparity. So it talks about all these different ways a person can deal with being treated differently, discriminated against, or targeted, but it's just not happening in one way. These different things intertwine and they have a compounded effect instead of just person deals with this one thing, they're dealing with maybe 3, 4 things that are intertwined that might make their life more difficult. The effects of discrimination on human growth and development. So this begins on page 251, and let's see where it ends. It ends on page 256. Basically, it goes into some conversations about things that have been done to Black Americans and African Americans living in the United States. So the textbook talks about slavery, and then it talks about the Civil War and basically how the North, it wasn't that they wanted slavery to end, it's just that they didn't feel like they could compete with the amount of money that people were making from slavery in the South. So that was their reasoning for wanting to end slavery. Of course, there were always people that did not believe slavery was okay, but usually they were also targeted for having those beliefs and wanting to believe in humans and people. So the textbook talks about different systems when it came to slavery. How it took away their art forms, political systems, family patterns, religious beliefs, and economic systems. Basically, these things were taken away from them, and they were prohibited from doing anything that would make them happy or make them grow or to help society. Talked about how they were beaten, they were profited from, they were sold, they were eaten. And then also, if people were married or had children, how families were torn apart because according to the people that were in charge, it just didn't matter. And it talked a lot about how the law was okay and supported slavery, and it supported the fact that people had to work for long hours so that way there could be a profit made and help the U.S. become the major powerhouse that it ended up becoming. A lot of things were made for people and done for people, and they didn't have to do the work themselves. They just had groups of people doing it. And over time, those groups changed. It talked about, the book earlier on talked about how some Asian Americans were enslaved in the U.S. And then it only talked a little bit about it, but it did mention that. It also mentioned people being put in camps. So it talked also, moving on, it talked about whippings, mutilations, hangings, lynchings, sundown towns. It talked about how Abraham Lincoln didn't believe in freeing people. It really wasn't about the people, it was just about economics. Talked about Jim Crow laws, and it added burnings into the situation. It had a caste system. You might hear of other countries having a caste system. The U.S. had one at the time. Talked about how with World War II, Black people and African Americans were able to move across the U.S. So that's when people left the South when they could, and they moved into other areas. It'd be like the North or more toward the West. Then there was Brown versus the Board of Education. It kind of is just jumping from different things. Of course, it leaves a lot out of the history of the U.S., but it does put in some information. Most of this you probably have heard before. Brown versus Board of Education. There were some situations before and after that made things different, but that let people go to school together. And the point of that at the time was just to have more resources spread out. Because before it was this group had the resources and the Black people and African Americans did not have the resources. They're still able to learn, but they didn't have access to like pencils or papers or things like that. So, and their schools were impoverished while the government was giving other students who were previously like Polish or Irish or English or Protestants or Catholics. They were given access to resources, education, training, things that could help them grow and fulfill their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as we love to talk about in the U.S. So it talks about a lot of these negative things. It goes into the 60s. It talks about, the book also mentions the Red Summer, and that was a time where there was a lot of protests and then a lot of people being slaughtered and killed in the U.S. For fighting against what they were placed into and wanting their kids to be free and have a better life. A lot of textbooks don't talk about a lot of the uprisings that happened, but there were many uprisings, and that was also part of the issue when it came to the government back then deciding, Lincoln and all the people deciding if they wanted to keep slavery or not. There were people who would fight back a lot continuously. They had different ways of communicating that the people who were over them did not know. So people also got tired of dealing with that because they would end up losing family members or end up having some of their property destroyed, and they considered people property, they considered the land property, the crops, all of that. So there were uprisings that aren't taught about. But if you're interested in that, you could look toward the textbook, you could look toward other books. If you're interested in that, if you needed it for research or just had an interest. So it talks about a lot of these negative things, but I'm going to move on to some of the positive things that came, that people use to deal with these situations, and that's like having strong bonds, strong kinship. Even to this day, people that are Black and or African American, they have a kinship that they believe is really important. They group together, they fellowship together. They're continuously discussing things and have to look out for one another because of things that have happened in the past. And the parents might have passed some of that fear down. So people try to come up with ways to learn the system and to basically still find a way to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness despite anything that might have been thrown at them. Also self-reliance, knowing that they might have to work hard, twice as hard, 3 times as hard, as some people have been told. To know that they might be poor, but they might be strong with love and family, and then also to make sure that they use that to support one another no matter what is going on. Also learning that they should achieve what they can and work together to rely on one another, so that way they could help get themselves, their family, maybe their neighborhoods out of poverty. And then a lot of them have strong religious ties or spiritual ties. And so they're going back to nature and the earth and, some of their ancestral ties. The book also talks about people who seek help from social agencies or people who try to join those agencies or join communities or jobs that they believe that they could help. Such as teachers, police officers, judges, government jobs, just knowing that they can continue on with their lot in life despite what has happened, and they can still have their own version of the American dream since everyone has their own version. The book does talk about how BLM started in 2013 after a child was murdered by a man. If you want to learn more about that, that's on page 253. It talks about the negative effects of being discriminated against and how children who are around the age of 7 are able to take notice that there's something about them that people don't like or don't love as much as they love other characteristics like different kids might have. They learn that by how people treat them, look at them. Kids can tell, who is loved or cared for more as far as society goes. So like if their teacher treats them better than someone else or teach someone less than someone else, kids are able to view those things and they make their own judgments as of why. And that could hurt somebody's self-determination, self-concept, self-esteem. Um, of course, that can be combated by having a strong family bond, having continuous love being taught outside of school, outside of home, and teaching that child to love who they are, exactly how they are. The textbook talks about the Afrocentric perspective and basically saying that despite what happens, people can work together to learn more about their connection to Africa, learn more about their ancestry, learn more about the languages and the customs people had back then. Maybe creating new customs, trying to bridge from other lands they might have come from to their current status nowadays. And so it talks about focusing on positivity, finding slogans or ways of loving themselves, teaching their children to love themselves, basically combating the things that they might see in the media or might hear from other people, and finding ways to pour into one another with a lot of positivity, a lot of safe spaces, and a lot of ways of letting people know that it's okay to be who they are, even if someone's rejecting them for how they are and who they are, just knowing that they are loved just the way they are, that they're part of nature, they're part of to see themselves in these institutions such as museums and to know what has happened, but also to focus on their morals, spirituality, humanity, how they care for one another, how they educate one another, how they have a kinship with the earth, how despite what has happened, they are and they will and they'll continue. So learning more about the Afrocentric perspective starts on page 254 and it ends on 256. So strategies for advancing social and economic justice. There are different models for change. There's a locality development model, and that's for broad participation. It's helping people up at the community level and is getting people from different walks of life. There are different things that social workers can do, but basically coming in and trying to make things better. No matter where the people are, no matter what they're dealing with, whether what health issues or if they live in a food desert where they don't have proper grocery stores but might only have fast food places, teaching people how to make food on a budget or make their meal stretch but still make it be nutritious, letting people know that they have access to buses and how to get around, or maybe even working to fight to make sure that there's more buses that travel at later times so that way people could work longer hours. Just connecting people with resources that can make them have an easier life, connect them to education, connect them to resources that they want to start a business, connect them to other people that are like-minded, making sure their children, especially the brightest of the children, are put into schools despite where they live, that could help nurture what they already have, so they could have similar opportunities to other kids. And then there's a social planning model, and it basically deals with problem solving. So what is the community missing, and how can we help them? They might have to have focus groups where they talk to the actual people of the community to see what they need, and then a moderator or somebody who's in charge might take notes or just make sure people don't argue and make sure everyone's heard. There is a social action model, and that is when people are disadvantaged and they want to come together to make change. So that could be maybe getting a certain factory out of their area, because of course that could lead to pollution, asthma, things like that. So they might want to redistribute how resources are given, so that way they're able to have more of a say in their own neighborhoods. So the book has examples of that also, and examples of research that has been done. And then there's also social advocacy, and that's basically applying pressure, doing demonstrations, having education, making sure that media also is portraying the education, making sure that people know that just because the situation is bad doesn't mean that they have to stay in it, and working together and getting what they have been deprived of from before to make things more equitable. Not equal, but equitable. Making sure people are met where they're at and seeing what can be done to help lift up those communities, such as if there's a community that's dealing with violence, One of the better things to do is to add parks and play areas and daycares, things like that. If kids stay busy and have places to learn and to be safe and to be kids and have fun and enjoy themselves, less violence will be around them, and as they age, they'll be less likely to partake in violence. Doing simple things like adding sidewalks, those are things that could decrease any violence that could be going on. And then the people in the community, if there's anybody that is still trying to do negative things around the children, it's just pushing them out. So there will be advocacy from social workers, and also doing things to change policies or laws or resources so people have more help and want to make things different. So it's good to promote social and economic justice as far as social work goes, and also using the media to help emphasize and to show people in a different light. So that way there isn't just one negative story being told of a certain group of people or situation. It's showing people in different lights. Like there could be somebody who's involved in gang violence, but there also could be somebody who is president or on the Supreme Court or on the school board. Making sure that people realize that there are more good in people than there are negatives, and that activism could be good for everybody. It could make everybody much safer, so that there will be less violence, less opportunities for people to rob one another, less reasons for them to do that. If they have access to work, people are less likely to partake in violence or cheating or robbery, just crime in general. If people have a purpose, people believe in themselves, people have ways to stay busy, and people are able to accomplish things and see that they can make changes in their lives, they're less likely to commit crimes. The more that groups work together and come together and realize that they're all people, then people are less likely to commit crimes. People have something to look forward to, and they also have a way to get a break. Some countries focus a lot on giving people breaks as far as vacation goes and taking some time off, and some don't. The U.S. is one of the ones that doesn't, but when people are able to maybe come together and give each other a break, like maybe one parent might take on, 4 or 5 kids of the group to babysit, and everyone gets to go do something fun, and they'll switch it around to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. But when they do that, people are able to have a better life and better experiences. So, looking at the different types of framework, it talks about people doing things to create change. It talks about Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement on page 265. If you want to learn more about that, it talks about politics, making change when it comes to that. It talks about discrimination. It talks about programs, of how certain programs were used to try and correct things. Affirmative action, you might hear things about that nowadays, but if you want to learn why it started, that is on page 264, and then how, of course, over time it was broken down to be less and less information about affirmative action. But basically, the textbook and research has shown that it was just to make sure that there were other people on the boards than people that were originally there. Just so other people had an opportunity to. Of course, those things have changed, and, in present day, people feel like they're not needed, but there is some information on that on 264. It talks about businesses on 267. If you want to look at an ethical dilemma, it talks about native indigenous people, and casinos. And that is the ethical dilemma on page 268. If you're seeing some of the conversations that they're having and the critiques and the benefits that people have gotten from casinos. Let's see. Asset-based community development looks at what is missing, what do people need, and how can they get funding for those things, or how to make changes. So that could be at the local level, the state level, But it's important to start within the community and to look at people as people and not just a number. Human rights. So there's a Council on Social Work Education. It has an educational policy and accreditation standards, but it basically talks about human rights. Those are on page 271. I will list a few of those, but if you want to see the entire list, then you can go to that page. So, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talks about right to recognition as a person, right to a nationality, right to property, right to freedom, right to economic, social, and cultural rights necessary for dignity and free development of personality, right to security, so there are different ones that you can look into on page 271, but the list, of course, is much longer than what I just stated. And then it talks about what might be necessary in order to make things better. It talks about ethnic sensitive practice, just basically making sure a person understands the group that they're working with, and taking that as value versus as something that, makes the situation harder or makes it to where the person doesn't deserve what they have. Everyone's unique. People's stories are unique, and using whatever they have already to empower them to help make changes for themselves, but also to make sure that it's sustainable. So it means like after the researchers and the developers and the people with the money go away and leave to help another group, that they want to make sure this group is still able to continue on in their neighborhoods and their communities to make things easier for their children and the future. So basically, it focuses on their strengths. What strengths do they already have that can be expounded upon, and what can they do to make sure it's culturally inviting or culturally relevant for the people that are dealing with the situations. So there are lists of 1 through 10 of things that the textbook believes social workers could do when it comes to the strengths perspective. Those are listed on 274 to 275. So one thing it says is learn about their own culture. But there are 10 different ones. Another one that it says is be aware of the impacts of social policies, programs on diverse client populations, and advocate for improvements in these programs. So just like any group has standards, nurses have standards, doctors have standards, firefighters have standards, police officers have standards, so do social workers. It also talks about cultural humility and just making sure that people are able to be comfortable with who they are while also being comfortable with who other people are. So they have to have a lifelong commitment to evaluating themselves, evaluating, how they come off or the way they're helping people. They want to fix the power structure, and they also want to develop partnerships with people on a human level. Things social workers could do: learn from the group, work with the group, reevaluate themselves, learn about their religion, accept that they might have a different way of dealing with health issues or spiritual issues or community issues, and combining or merging the ideas a social worker has with the ideas of what the people already have in their community. It could be folk healers or religious institutions, social clubs. It might be the fact that the family moves as a unit versus just as one person dealing with an issue. Making sure that they're aware of prejudices, stereotypes, and values of the people that they're dealing with. And just making sure that they understand. You have to understand who people are and what they want in order to help them. And it's okay to learn from the people, even as a professional. So the book gives different examples of different groups of people who might learn a different way than what you might have been taught. But just basically, a lot of groups put a lot of put an emphasis on family and respect and working together and making decisions as a group. They also might take some scientific approaches when it comes to making things better, but they still will rely on maybe folk healers and people in the community. They also might not want to depart from how they are as far as assimilation. So prior, many people would assimilate as soon as they could in order to be part of America, but sometimes people don't fully assimilate or integrate, and just realizing that some people haven't yet, or maybe they don't plan to, and still having the ability as a social worker to still work with them to make sure that the community is still able to elevate. So there's different ways a social worker can help. It can be for justice, a social economic justice. It could be education, advocacy. They can analyze the current conditions or discrimination and make things better. They can initiate to find resources for the group. They can educate themselves. They can educate organizations, or they can educate the community. As far as coordination goes, they can work with organizations or work as a counselor in order to solve the problems that the community has. And they can also be brokers as a social worker and making sure they know what the client needs and making sure that they have access to those resources.